They will tell you the cow was taken by something that did not walk. They will say there were lights over the pasture, and the cuts were too clean to belong to teeth or claw, and the silence afterward was the silence of a crime scene. It makes for a fine story on a cold night, with the wind worrying the eaves and the coffee gone black in the cup. But the first truth of it, what always comes first, is a man counting living bodies in a field and coming up short. It is morning in southern Colorado, where the land sits high enough to thin the breath and hard enough to teach a person not to waste it. The grass is winter burnt, even in the good months, and the sage gives off its bitter medicine when you brush it with a boot. Somewhere nearby, a highway's already awake. Semis shouldering their way through the dark, like indifferent gods. And the sound of their tires comes and goes in long, low breaths. A ranch is never truly quiet. Even when nothing moves, you can hear money ticking in the background. Water, feed, fencing, the unseen arithmetic that decides whether a year ends in black ink or red. He rides out to check the herd the way men have always ridden out to check the herd. He looks for the small things first. A gate not latched the way he latched it. A stretch of barbed wire bowed where it shouldn't be. A water trough half full when it ought to be rinsed clean and topped off. Then he looks for heads. Cattle stand with their backs to the wind, broad and patient, each one a warm engine wrapped in hide. A mature cow can run on 100 to 300 pounds easy, and she carries inside her, quiet as a secret, something like 8 to 10 gallons of blood depending on size. When one dies wrong, you usually see it. The ground takes its payment. The ants and flies take theirs. The prairie writes the autopsy in plain ink. But this one is laid out in the grass like a question nobody wants to read. Up close, the body is not torn the way coyotes tear, not ragged, not frantic. The hide is opened with a kind of deliberate economy, edges that look less like feeding and more like removal. The tongue is gone, cut back where it roots deep. An eye is missing, and around it the flesh looks as if a circle has been measured and taken. Under the jaw, along the soft parts where a knife would go if a man meant to be efficient, something has been excised. And where there should be a slick of dark blood in the dust, where there should be the honest mess of a 1,200-pound animal coming apart, there is, instead, a troubling cleanliness. Grass bent, soil unconfessed. No drag marks, no tire tracks, no boot prints that say, "Here's your answer." Cases like this, across southern Colorado, have been described the same way. Missing parts, fine cuts, no obvious tracks, no blood where you'd expect it. He squats there and he studies it, because ranch people study what the world hands them. They study clouds and calves and bank statements. They study the way trouble arrives, slow at first, then all at once. He reaches out, maybe, and touches the hide. It is cool under his fingers. The sun is coming up, and the smell is starting, faint and sweet and wrong, the first note of rot. A hawk turns overhead, riding the air like it owns it. The cow does not so much look dead as emptied, edited, revised. He makes the calls a person is supposed to make. The sheriff's office, maybe. A deputy who has seen wrecks on the highway and bar fights in town and men who can't pay child support and who now has to stand over a cow in a pasture and pretend the world is orderly. What do you write down? What do you photograph? Who do you blame? Out here, evidence doesn't sit still. Sun and scavengers and rumor get to it first. A proper necropsy costs money. often hundreds of dollars, sometimes more. And you don't always have it to burn on a dead animal when you're still trying to keep the living ones alive. And so the scene becomes what these scenes so often become: a rural wound with no clean bandage. The deputy says there's nothing to follow up on. The rancher says the cuts were there before the animal died, or he swears they were, because he needs the world to have a shape that makes sense. Somebody mentions predators. Somebody else mentions people. And then, because America is a country that cannot leave an unanswered question alone, somebody mentions the other thing, the thing that doesn't require a suspect you can actually catch: the sky, the hidden government, the black helicopter, the story that feels bigger than a man with a knife because it has room for all the helplessness you've ever swallowed. On this particular stretch of story, the name Miller keeps coming up, tied to a ranch near Trinidad, tied to a long accumulation of dead cattle, and the sour knowledge that the world can reach into your pasture and take from you without leaving a receipt. In televised retellings, the count is given as 16 mutilations stacked over years. Alongside a second tally, more than 15 traffic fatalities on a highway that cuts through the property, as if the land itself keeps a ledger of bodies. So here's the question, the one that will not go away, not in Colorado, not in the American West, not in a nation built on animals and acreage and stories. When a cow is found opened with precision and missing the same parts again and again, is it an epidemic of human cruelty and opportunism? Someone practicing, someone profiting, someone punishing? Or is it nature and time performing their ugly work in ways our brains mistake for intention? And if the facts alone can't settle it, if even federal authorities once said they lacked the jurisdiction to settle it, what does that hunger for an extraordinary answer reveal about the country that keeps asking? Here's the pact. I'll keep making long, slow stories that refuse to sprint past the hard parts, and you'll subscribe so the algorithm can't bury them for being too patient. If you want this kind of depth to survive, you know what to do. They'll tell it to you like a bedtime story. That the trouble at the Miller place began with a flash of cold light over the cottonwoods, a hovering craft, a hush that rolled down the draws like fog. That the first proof was up in the sky, but the first proof was down in the grass. A calf. Less than a few days old, the kind still a little unsteady in the knees, still learning the shape of the world by bumping into it. Hours earlier, it had been running, just running, for no reason other than that it could. Then it went quiet. And when they found it, there was the work done to it. Work so clean it didn't look like teeth or talons, not ripped, not torn, cut. And the ground around it held no story, no tracks, no predator marks, no drag, nothing to show the animal had fought or bled or even understood what was happening. So they called the sheriff. They called whoever would come. And all those men could do was stand there and look down and say the same thing a person says when they run out of explanations. There's nothing. That's where it starts, not with prophecy, with paperwork. Because after that first calf, 1996, by their own account, they stopped treating it like a one-time horror and started treating it like a ledger. They began cataloging, photographing, marking a map with pen lines and little dots. They didn't do it because they were chasing mystery. They did it because ranchers learn early, if you don't count your losses, the world will count them for you. Out there, loss isn't a metaphor, it's arithmetic. The Miller Ranch sits outside Trinidad, Colorado, high country in the far south of the state, where the air thins out around 6,000 feet and the land tilts toward New Mexico like a long, tired shoulder. You can drive north and hit the hard rise of Raton Pass, 7,834 feet of wind and grade, where the old trails and the modern interstate both insist on squeezing through the same notch in the Sangre de Cristo. It's a place made by corridors. The pass, the river valley, the rail line that clawed its way in during September of 1878, Santa Fe track reaching Trinidad, steel and money, following the old ruts of the trail. And even the city's own birth reads like a legal document more than a romance, an act of incorporation dated February 1st, 1876, signed into existence like a claim, staked on paper. And just outside that old coal and rail town, the river runs. The Purgatoire, some call it the Purgatory, some the Picket Wire, cutting east across Las Animas County, a river that can look like a thread one season and a force the next, born up in the Sangre de Cristo and turning at Trinidad before it heads out toward the plains. The ranch lies along that kind of water, the kind you map your life around, the kind you fight over with neighbors you'll still have to wave at in church. This is not hobby land. This is not weekend cowboy country. Tom Miller is described in a Colorado State University Extension story as a second-generation rancher, someone who has worked the place and several hundred head of cattle his entire life. The body breaks down before the work does. In that same account, he's still out there at 79 years old, after surgeries to back and neck and shoulder, still ranching, still vaccinating, still close enough to an angry mother cow to take a broken cheek if he gets the distance wrong. And the show business version, the one that brought the wider world sniffing around, puts the place at probably about 1,600 acres, a small kingdom by Western standards, a large responsibility by any standard, 16 mutilations since 1996, they say, as recently as 2020. That's the number that gets repeated because it's clean and countable. It fits in a sentence. But out on the land, the number doesn't arrive as a statistic. It arrives as a morning chore that turns into an autopsy. And that's the thing about cattle. People talk about them like they're just inventory. But inventory breathes. Inventory calves. Inventory panics when a storm snaps the fence line. Inventory carries 5 or 6 gallons of blood in its system, enough to paint a scene, enough to soak the ground black and sticky if it's spilled the normal way. Yet the refrain at the Miller Ranch is no blood, not a drop, not even when the cuts are fresh enough that the animal, they say, has been dead only hours. So what is a rancher supposed to do with that? There's a myth in this country that ranching is freedom, wide horizons, no bosses, a man and his horse and the weather. But the reality is it's one of the most structured lives on earth. The day is a chain: water, feed, fence, health, calving, records. And every link is tied to money whether you admit it or not. You can romanticize it all you want. But the cow doesn't care. The bank doesn't care. Winter doesn't care. In the Miller story, the beginning is not spectacle. It's a decision. They could have shrugged, called it coyotes, and moved on like so many people do when something ugly lands in their yard. They could have swallowed the loss like a bad mouthful and kept walking. Instead, they documented. They made a map. They put pins in the past and drew lines through their own disbelief. Was that prudence? Or was it the first step into a labyrinth one where every new dot on that hand-drawn paper would drag more strangers to their gate, more theories to their kitchen table, more heat into a life built for weather and solitude, because once you start counting something, you invite the world to count it with you. And out there, outside Trinidad, along that river, under that thin, hard sky, counting has consequences. The ranch has been framed in the descriptions of the television episode that made it famous as a place with 16 cattle mutilations and over 15 traffic fatalities on a highway running through the property. A road that doesn't ask permission, a ribbon of speed and steel that slices through pasture the way history slices through families, indifferent, relentless, collecting its own toll. So this is the origin story in its true shape. A calf in 1996. A rancher with a pen, a map that starts empty and slowly fills. Not a legend told around a fire, a record, and records are dangerous things in America. Because once you have them, you have a question you can't unask. You can stand in the wind and tell yourself it's nothing. Or you can look down at the clean cuts, the silent ground, the missing blood, and admit that something is taking place on your land that doesn't fit the ordinary brutal logic of predation. Is it just nature wearing a mask? Or is it something else entirely, something human, something organized, something that thrives in the gaps between what we can prove and what we can bear to live with? They say the first report came in like a scream. A rancher galloping into town, hat in hand, eyes wide, swearing to God he'd seen something in the sky. But the reality is quieter. The reality is a receiver lifted off its cradle in a kitchen that smells like coffee gone stale. A man staring out a window at a stretch of country he cannot afford to be sentimental about. The reality is a phone call made the way men make calls when they don't want to be mocked, short on adjectives, long on restraint. He doesn't say aliens. He doesn't say surgical. He says what he can defend. I've got a dead animal out here. Something's wrong with it. That year sits in the story like a nail. The millers can tell you the year the counting began because the year is what you put on paper when you want your memory to hold still. A ranch is full of years like that. Drought years, blizzard years, the year calves died in the mud, the year the bank got tight, the year you nearly quit. This becomes another one. The year the first cut appeared that didn't look like hunger. The year the pasture stopped feeling like property and started feeling like a place that could be entered without permission. The Miller place, about 2,600 acres, they say, has the kind of distances that make a person careful with gasoline and careful with time. A dead cow is not always obvious from the road. You don't stumble upon it like you would in a city alley. You find it by absence, by a missing shape in the herd, by a mother walking the fence line bawling at nothing, by a count that comes up wrong when the sun's low and the light makes all the black hides look the same. So he rides out, slow, because there's always the possibility it's something ordinary. A birth gone bad, a snake bite, a fence injury, a sickness that moved faster than you did. And in the back of his mind sits the unglamorous math of cattle. One head can be $1,500 at the low end, or $3,000 and more when the market is kind and the animal is good. The money isn't greed, it's survival, it's hay, it's diesel. It's the payment on a tractor that doesn't care about your pride. He comes over a rise and sees it, a body on its side, legs bent as if it sat down and forgot to stand back up. No ravens working it yet, or maybe they're waiting in the cottonwoods like witnesses who know the law can't touch them. He gets down and walks in. The grass is still wet in the shade. The air has that thin mineral smell the country carries in the morning, like stone turned to breath. At first, you see what you expect to see, the blunt fact of death. Then you see what doesn't belong. The mouth looks wrong. Not chewed, not torn, opened. You can tell the difference if you've lived with animals long enough. Teeth leave ragged scripture, claws leave chaos. But this looks as if someone knew where to go and went there with intent. The tongue is missing, maybe an eye. Maybe flesh from the jawline where the hide is thin and the meat is easy. A wound that is not an attack so much as an absence. Something removed, something taken away. And then you look for the mess. A cow is not small. A mature animal can carry something like 8 to 10 gallons of blood in its body. When the body is opened, blood should be there the way gravity should be there. It should pool. It should stain the dirt. It should paint the grass dark. That's what ranchers expect because that's what the world has always done. But the ground is almost clean, not spotless. Nothing in nature is spotless, but clean enough to make you feel a wrongness in your teeth. Clean enough to make you stand up and look around, half expecting to see the answer crouched behind a yucca or leaned against a fence post with a cigarette. And this is where the story begins to split, because what happens next isn't just the carcass, it's the telling of it. He calls it in, and the person on the other end of the line has to translate a rancher's unease into something that fits a form. Address, location, nature of the incident, any suspects, any weapons. You can't write impossible in a report. You can't write the cuts look too clean for this world. You write deceased cow, missing tissue, unknown cause. A deputy arrives when he can. That might be an hour. It might be 3. Las Animas County is not built for quickness. And when he steps out of the vehicle and walks into the pasture, he's walking into a kind of social trap. If he laughs, he's disrespecting a man's livelihood. If he takes it too seriously, he risks becoming the punchline at the cafe. Somewhere in him, there's also the plain fatigue of the job, wrecks on the highway, domestic calls, meth, petty theft. Now, this, he takes notes, he looks for tracks. He finds none that satisfy. The earth in parts of that country is hard as fired clay when it's dry, and when it's wet, it holds prints for days. Unless the wind comes and scours it, unless cattle have already wandered through and erased the handwriting. Evidence is fragile out there. Sun bakes it. Coyotes edit it. Time rewrites it. And when the deputy leaves, what remains is the gap. A gap is where stories breed. The rancher tells his wife or his brother or the neighbor who came over after hearing something on the scanner. Each retelling is an attempt to pin the thing down. The cuts get cleaner. The blood gets less. The strangeness gets stranger. Not because anyone is lying. Most people aren't interesting enough to lie well, but because the human mind hates an open question. It can live with pain. It can live with loss. But it struggles to live with meaningless pain and meaningless loss. And soon the language arrives that will haunt the story from then on. Mutilation. It's a word that doesn't just describe. It accuses. It implies intention. It implies malice. It implies a hand behind the knife. You don't say mutilation if you mean coyote. You don't say mutilation if you mean disease. You say mutilation when you mean someone did this. Was that an act of clarity? Or was it the first brick in a wall, building a mystery sturdy enough to live in? Because by the time the Millers look back across the years, By the time the number has become 16 incidents spread from 1996 to as late as 2020, the first carcass is no longer just a carcass. It's the opening chapter of a myth. And myths, once opened, don't stay on the page. They step out into the pasture and begin to walk around like they own the land. The deputy's report goes into a file. The file goes into a drawer. The drawer closes. But the rancher stays out there with the herd, with the wind, with the silent arithmetic of head counts and fence lines. He is left with the one detail that won't let him sleep. The detail that turns the ordinary, brutal world of ranching into something stranger. Not the missing tongue, not the missing eye. The cleanliness. So tell me, was that absence of blood just the prairie doing what it always does? Fast and efficient and indifferent? Or was it the first sign that whatever was happening out there knew exactly how to leave no mess at all? They say the cuts are too perfect to be nature. They say a blade did it, or a beam, or a thing with no name that left no footprints because it did not need feet. But the truth, what a ranch teaches you if you live long enough to be humbled by it, is that nature can look like intelligence when you arrive late to the scene. A cow dies out on 1,600 acres, and the land does not pause for grief. The land gets to work. It starts with time. It always starts with time. Not the grand kind, years and generations and deeds filed at courthouses, but the small, brutal kind measured in hours. A body is warm. Then it is cooling. The heart stops, and the blood, those 8 or 10 gallons you can't not think about once you've seen a cow bleed out, stops moving like a river and starts behaving like a pond. It settles low. It thickens. It clots in places you won't see unless you open the animal the way a veterinarian does, with gloves and steel and the patience to name what is inside. Out on the range, you do not see the inside. You see what the outside tells you, and the outside is a liar after death. The eyes cloud. The tongue slackens. The soft places, mouth, anus, udder, the thin hide under the jaw, begin to announce themselves to the first scavengers that arrive. And scavengers don't think in drama. They think in access. They go where flesh is easiest and where the hide doesn't fight back. So the birds come. A raven can open a seam with a beak the way a man opens a letter. Quick, practiced, almost delicate. A vulture doesn't need to tear the whole animal apart to make its living. It just needs a purchase point. A starting place. The eyes are first because they are already wet and exposed. The tongue comes next because it is soft, because it's there, because it is a handle in the mouth. If you never watched it happen, you imagine it must be a mess. But it can be neat. It can be terrifyingly neat. A hole cut clean by a beak and widened by time can look like a circle drawn with intention. And then the insects arrive like an army you don't hear until you're already surrounded. Flies don't wait for permission. They find death fast, sometimes within minutes, because death is their economy. They lay eggs in the moist folds, in the wounds, in the mouth. And depending on heat and wind and shade, those eggs can turn into feeding larvae in less than a day. A rancher comes out in the morning and sees a carcass that looks fresh because it isn't bloated yet, because the hide still has its sheen, because the animal hasn't burst open like a spoiled fruit. But inside, decomposition has already started its slow boil. Gas is building. Pressure is rising. The skin tightens and dries in the sun until it looks leathery, until it pulls back from cuts and makes them look sharper than they were when they were made. This is how an edge becomes surgical, and the blood, always the blood, plays its own tricks. If an animal is dead before the cuts happen, there may not be a dramatic spill, not the way you expect. Blood doesn't pump without a heart. It seeps. It pools. It sinks into soil that's thirsty and dark and ready to hide evidence. It dries fast in high country air. It gets consumed by insects so small you never think to blame them. And if the body is opened in a place where gravity pulls the fluids inward, down into the body cavity, down into the grass under the belly, you can walk around the carcass and see no blood, and still be standing on it. Out there, a deputy kneels in the dirt and looks for tracks, and the ground offers him nothing. And that, too, has explanations that feel like insults when you're the one losing cattle. The soil is hard. Wind has blown all night. The herd has wandered through and trampled what little sign there was. Coyotes are light-footed, and birds leave almost no trace at all. You can have a death scene visited by a dozen animals and still find nothing but your own boot prints and the marks of your tires where you parked. But ranchers aren't fools. They know coyotes. They know what a mountain lion does to a calf. They know the ragged tear of a dog pack. They know the way predators drag, the way they cache, the way they leave hair and scat and panic written in the dirt. What they don't know, what unsettles them, is when the scene doesn't read like hunger, because hunger is messy. Hunger is chaotic. Hunger is loud. And the Miller story from 1996 onward is haunted by scenes that feel curated, not destroyed, curated. Pieces missing that seem chosen, tongues, eyes, jaw, flesh, the same list repeating like a refrain. And when repetition enters the picture, the human mind starts sharpening itself into a weapon. It starts looking for the hand behind it. Was it a person, a ritual, a business, a prank that turned into an obsession? Or was it simply that nature, across thousands of years, has learned the same lesson every scavenger learns? Go for the soft parts first, because soft parts pay the fastest. There's another force at work here, quieter than predators and louder than myth: pride. A ranch is a world where competence matters because incompetence kills. If you misjudge weather, you lose calves. If you misjudge a fence line, you lose a herd. If you misjudge sickness, you lose a year. So when something happens that doesn't fit the rancher's mental library of causes, it threatens more than the pocketbook. It threatens identity. It tells a person, you do not understand your own land. And a person will believe many things before they will believe that. So they take photographs. They mark dates. They count incidents, 16 by some accounts, stretching as far as 20 by 20, because numbers feel like control, even when control is the very thing you've lost. And those numbers begin to travel. They leave the property the way smoke leaves a fire, carried by wind, carried by conversation, carried by the oldest engine in America, the telling. A neighbor hears no blood and repeats drained. A cousin hears clean cut and repeats laser. A stranger hears missing tongue and repeats harvested. The words gain weight the farther they go, because distance makes everything larger. And then one day, someone who doesn't mend fences for a living asks for directions to the ranch. A reporter, a producer, a man with a camera. Someone who can turn an ugly, confusing death into a clean narrative with villains and questions and a title you can print in bold. They will park on the shoulder, step into the wind, and look across the same pasture the rancher looks across, and they will see a story before they see a cow. So tell me, when the land itself can counterfeit intention, when beetles and birds and heat can make a carcass look precise, what happens when that counterfeit reaches the newsroom and gets stamped into a headline as truth? They say the press came to shine a light on the truth, that once the cameras arrived, the shadows would have to behave, that the story would finally be forced to pick a side, fact or hoax, and sit still long enough for the public to understand it. But the reality is the cameras came because shadows sell. A ranch is not built for visitors. It is built for work. The roads are not roads so much as agreements. 2 ruts in the dirt, a gate that must be opened and shut the way it was found, a length of fence that exists to keep the world separated into mine and not mine. Out on 1/600 acres, a stranger's vehicle doesn't just arrive, it announces itself for miles. Dust first, then sound, then the shape of it, cresting a rise slow and cautious, like it knows it is trespassing even if it isn't. It's late morning, that kind of Colorado light that makes every object look cut from metal. The air is thin and clear and mean. You can smell sun on dry grass. You can smell sage bruised under tires. And underneath it, faint, wrong, lingering, you can smell what death leaves behind, even after it's been hauled off. That sweet, greasy note like spoiled fruit and old iron, the rancher watches from the yard or from the edge of the pasture, and he already knows what this is. Not help, not justice. Attention. The reporter steps out with a notepad and a microphone. Or maybe it's not a reporter anymore. It's a producer with a crew, because by the time a story about mutilations gets enough momentum, print isn't fast enough. You need video. You need a voice. You need a face. The producer wears boots that have never seen manure. The cameraman squints into the glare like it's personal. They introduce themselves with practiced calm, the kind you use when you're asking a stranger to reopen a wound for public viewing. They want the details. How many? When did it start? What exactly was missing? The rancher says 1996 because that's the year he can defend. That's the year the counting began. He says it started with a calf because calves are what people understand. Small, innocent, wronged. He says there have been 16 cases by their tally because numbers make an abstract fear tangible, and because 16 is still a number you can say without your voice shaking. He says the last one happened as recently as 2020 because it matters that it didn't die out. That time didn't cure it. He says it's always the same parts, tongues, eyes, jaw, flesh, because repetition is the hook that catches a listener and won't let go. And then, because the world is never satisfied with one body count, he mentions the other ledger people love to repeat. Over 15 traffic fatalities on the highway that cuts through the property. That last detail lands like a match in dry grass. The producer's eyes brighten just slightly, the way a man's eyes brighten when he sees the shape of something that will work on television. Because now the ranch is not merely a ranch. It is a place with a pattern, a place with a toll, a place with a reputation. The story has widened from cattle to people, and in America, human tragedy gives permission for every kind of speculation. They ask to see where it happened. So he takes them out. He walks them through grass that hides its own secrets. He points to a spot where a body lay, and it looks like nothing now, just a piece of ground, just dirt and weeds and sunlight, because the land does not keep evidence for you. The land erases. The land forgives nothing and forgets faster than any witness. That emptiness frustrates the crew. They want something to film that looks like horror. But horror, in real life, is often just a place where something used to be. So the producer begins to shape it. He asks the rancher to describe it again. Slower. He asks him to say, "no blood." He asks him to repeat, "clean cut." He asks him to tell how it made him feel. The rancher hesitates because feelings are not how ranchers talk about death. They talk about losses. They talk about costs. They talk about what must be done next. But the producer keeps the microphone near his mouth like a kind of gentle weapon, and eventually the rancher gives him something human. "I can't explain it." That line will be the spine of the segment, not because it's rare, but because it's universal. Everyone has had that feeling, standing over something broken and wanting a reason that matches the damage. The crew films B-roll of fences, gat latches, hoof prints, sky. They film the rancher walking alone because loneliness reads as gravitas. They film the highway because motion reads as menace. A semi passes and the sound is a long, low thunder, and for a moment you can understand why a man might believe the land itself has an appetite. They ask for the photographs. The rancher brings out a folder, paper worn at the edges, corners bent, because even mystery ends up in Manila. The crew spreads the photos across a table. The camera moves in close. And here is the transformation, the moment the rancher can feel but cannot stop. A dead cow becomes an image becomes a symbol becomes a product. In the edit, the rancher's hesitations will be cut away. The long pauses where he searched for honest words will be replaced with music. The neighbor's reasonable doubts will be trimmed because doubt is bad for pacing. The deputy who shrugged will become either a villain or a fool because a story needs antagonists even when reality only offers bureaucracy and fatigue. And the producer will thread it together in a way that makes the mystery feel inevitable, as if the ranch has always been this, always a site of strangeness, rather than a working operation trying to keep cattle alive between droughts and debt. The rancher is not naive. He knows attention can bring pressure. He knows it can bring trespassers. He knows it can bring ridicule that sticks to your family name like burrs. But he also knows what it feels like to be dismissed, to call for help and hear laughter in the silence. To watch a deputy drive away and realize the law doesn't have a shape for what you're describing. When the producer offers him a promise, "we'll take you seriously," it feels like relief. It feels like dignity. Was it dignity or was it a trade? Because the moment the ranch becomes a headline, it stops belonging entirely to the people who live there. The story becomes communal property, passed around, argued over, embellished, monetized. A stranger in another state will speak the name Miller Ranch, as if he knows it, as if he's been there, as if the lives inside it are just characters in a long-running national drama about the unknown. And that's the dark engine of it. The attention doesn't solve the mystery. It industrializes it. By the time the crew packs up and leaves, the pasture is still the pasture. The fence still sags where it sags. The cattle still need water. The rancher still wakes before dawn. But now there's something else living on the property, an invisible audience, 1,000 unseen eyes that will never fix a broken gate or pay for a necropsy, but will argue all day about what the rancher must have seen, what he must be hiding, what really happened. They say the cameras bring truth, but sometimes they bring a kind of gravity. They make the story heavier than the facts can carry. They pull older myths into the orbit, government cover-ups, black helicopters, secret experiments, the kind of narratives America has been rehearsing for a long time, long before 1996, long before anyone said 16 mutilations out loud. So tell me, when a modern ranch becomes a modern headline, is it the birth of a new mystery, or just the latest echo of an older American panic that was already waiting in the dark back in the 1970s for a reason to return? They'll tell you the 70s were when the sky came down to meet the pasture, that it was all lights and whispers and saucer talk, the kind of folklore that can survive any amount of ridicule because it doesn't ask for proof. It only asks for fear. But the reality of how that panic became real, how it got its boots on and walked into living rooms, starts with paper, with a senator's letter, with a date stamped into the corner like a warrant. August 29th, 1975. Washington has its own weather, its own air, thick with carpets and cigarette smoke, and the faint metallic scent of money handled by men who never touched dirt. In an office that did not smell like cattle or sage, United States Senator Floyd K. Haskell sat and wrote to the FBI in Denver to a man named Theodore P. Rozak. He did not write like a man chasing ghosts. He wrote like a man watching a fuse burn toward a powder keg. He said his office had been receiving reports for several months. He said at least 130 cases in Colorado alone had been reported to local officials and to the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. He said the incidents had been occurring for 2 years across 9 states. He didn't frame it as legend. He framed it as civic rot, rural people frightened and angry and beginning to believe that the state had abandoned them. And then he listed the injuries the way a rancher lists losses: plain, grim, specific. In virtually all the cases, he said, the left ear, the left eye, the rectum, and the sex organ of each animal had been cut away and the blood drained, with no traces of blood left on the ground and no footprints. Not much poetry in that, just an anatomy of dread. What he feared most wasn't whatever did it. What he feared was what the victims would do next. Because out in the counties where cattle are counted the way city people count dollars, men were arming themselves. They were setting up night watches. They were sitting in pickups with rifles across their knees, listening to the wind and the faint hum of engines and trying to decide whether that sound belonged to a neighbor coming home late or something hovering low over the fields. Haskell wrote it down without embellishment. Ranchers were arming themselves to protect their livestock, their families, themselves. And he warned the Bureau with a sentence that read like prophecy, "Clearly, something must be done before someone gets hurt." It wasn't a crazy fear. It was a practical one. Because once a man believes an invisible hand is reaching into his livelihood, reaching into his property, into his winter feed, into his children's inheritance, he begins to treat every shadow as a suspect. And suspects in rural America sometimes get shot before they get questioned. By the time that letter was written, the story had already gathered the ingredients that make a national fever: repetition, uncertainty, and a new machine called mass media, hungry for a strange headline. In 1975, the Colorado Associated Press would rank cattle mutilations as the #1 story in the state. Think about that. Not elections, not fires, not crime in Denver. Dead cows with missing parts, and when a story becomes the top story, it stops being about cows. It becomes a referendum on trust. This was post-Watergate America, post-assassinations, post-Vietnam. A country that had watched its leaders lie with clean faces was now being asked to accept that cattle were dying by ordinary means, and that the ordinary explanations, predators, disease, decay, were enough. But ordinary sounded like dismissal, and dismissal breeds conspiracy the way heat breeds flies. So the panic grew legs. Reports spread through Colorado, Nebraska, Kansas, Iowa, names that sound quiet until you remember they are stitched together by highways and radio stations and the same kind of coffee shops where rumors are traded like weather. Some people reported unmarked helicopters near the sites. Some claimed they were chased. Some claimed the aircraft hovered as if listening. Out in the fields, men began watching the sky with the same suspicion they once reserved for wolves. At the federal level, the story collided with something colder than fear: jurisdiction. On September 12, 1975, an FBI official documented a phone call with Senator Haskell. The senator wanted the Bureau to enter the investigation. The Bureau explained the limits. If this was theft, it fell under a statute that required something specific: interstate transport. They cited it by name like a locked door: the Interstate Transportation of Stolen Cattle Statute, Title 18, U.S. Code, Section 2311. In plain terms, the cow or its parts had to cross state lines, and someone had to be able to prove it. Haskell admitted he had no information that interstate transportation had occurred. He said it felt too big for local authorities. He believed the FBI's mere presence would deter whoever was doing it. And there, in that exchange, you can feel the whole American problem in miniature: the public begging for an authority that can't legally act, and the authority hiding behind the law not because it's evil, but because it's built to move only along certain tracks. Meanwhile, out on the ground, the panic didn't care what Title 18 said. In some places, the fear got so thick that even innocent aircraft became targets. A utility helicopter inspecting power lines was shot at. Agencies that relied on low-flying survey work began to pull back. In Nebraska, the National Guard reportedly raised the altitude of its exercises, flying 2,000 feet instead of $1,000, because jittery ranchers were starting to treat every rotor sound as an invasion. And hovering beneath all of it was an older American suspicion that didn't need UFOs at all. It needed only the government, because the government had, in living memory, tested things: chemicals, pathogens, weapons, out in the wide places where few people live and fewer still can prove what they saw. In March 1968, near Utah's Dugway Proving Ground, 6,000 sheep died after a nerve agent release, an event the Army would not fully own in public until much later. You tell a rancher that story, and then you tell him his cattle are turning up drained and cut, and you don't have to say the word conspiracy. It rises on its own. That is how the 70s echo begins, not with a spaceship, but with a nation already trained to distrust the official answer, with rural people watching their animals turn into exhibits, with a senator writing a letter because he can feel his constituents sliding toward vigilantism, with a federal agency answering in statutes and limitations while the pasture fills with stories too big to fence. And once the story becomes bigger than the facts, once it becomes statewide, then multi-state, then national, something else happens, something more American than any single theory. The mystery becomes a kind of crown, a grim notoriety, a title that lands on certain places and certain families whether they want it or not. So when that crown finally settles, When a ranch becomes famous not for its cattle, but for its dead cattle, who does it make powerful? And who does it make expendable? They'll tell you a ranch is a kingdom, that the man who owns the ground is a kind of monarch, hat brim low, hand steady, his word law from fence line to fence line. They'll tell you the West still has its royalty, and it wears denim. But the reality is colder. The reality is that most ranchers don't own a kingdom, they lease one. They borrow it. They work it on behalf of papermen who never touch a gate latch. And when a ranch becomes famous, when people start saying its name like a spell, it isn't crowned, it's branded. The Miller place sits out on about 1,600 acres, 10 quarter sections. If you want to think of it in the old language, 160 acres to a quarter section, the kind of math that came down through the Homestead Act of 1862 and never really left the American imagination. Land parceled into rectangles, dreams parceled into deeds. A man could get his hands on a square of earth if he was willing to bleed on it long enough. That was the myth. But a deed is only the first door. After that come the other doors: mortgages, taxes, water, insurance, the wind itself, collecting its rent. A ranch like that has two governments. One is the county and the state, brand inspectors, property assessments, the sheriff who knows your driveway. The other is the weather, and the weather doesn't negotiate. Still, from the road, it looks like power. A gate with a name on it, a long stretch of fence that says private, a herd, some years 200, some years 300, some years more if the grass is kind and the bank is patient, standing in a draw like a dark spill across the land. Cattle have a way of making ownership visible. In a country built on abstraction, stocks, bonds, digital numbers, nothing looks more real than living property. And that's why the story of mutilations curdles so quickly into something like treason, because it is not only an animal that is violated, it is the idea of dominion. The ancient bargain, this land is mine. These animals are mine. What happens here happens under my watch. A rancher can endure drought and disease because those things belong to the natural order. But an intrusion, an intelligence, human or otherwise, turns the ranch from a workplace into contested territory. That is how the royalty begins, not with wealth, but with attention. A producer calls, a writer calls, a man with a recorder calls, and the rancher, who has spent most of his life being invisible to the rest of America, suddenly finds himself treated like a keeper of secrets, like a man standing at the mouth of a cave the world wants to enter. They ask for the story again. They ask for dates, 1996 to 2020. They ask for numbers, 16 cases. They ask for proof. They ask for photographs. They ask for emotion. And all of it, every question, carries the same unspoken assumption. This is yours now. This mystery is your property. Produce it. So he walks them out where the grass grows thin and the wind never quite stops. He points to places where bodies lay. He points to where the highway runs, that strip of modern speed that cuts the ranch like a fresh wound. People like to add the other number then, 15, 16 traffic deaths, depending on who's counting, as if the land keeps a second ledger of human loss to match the cattle. The story fattens on the way it's told, because fat stories survive. The rancher becomes a figure in it whether he wants to or not. The Miller Ranch becomes a name spoken by strangers who have never fixed a fence, never paid for a load of hay, never watched a cow go down in a hard winter, and felt the sick private shame of not being able to save it. The ranch becomes a destination in the imagination. a place people visit in their minds first, and then, sometimes, in their trucks. And the thing about unwanted fame in rural country is that it rides in on the same road as every other kind of trouble. A strange vehicle pulled off near the gate. Somebody photographing the sign. Somebody asking directions at the gas station in Trinidad. Somebody stopping a neighbor to ask if they've seen lights in the sky. Each one is small. Together, they are a pressure. This is where the great man story would have you believe the rancher stands tall, a lone sentinel against the unknown. But the ranch doesn't run on lone sentinels. It runs on the invisible workforce, the spouse who keeps the books and makes the calls and knows which bill can be paid late, the hired hand whose name never makes the segment but whose back keeps the place upright, the neighbor who shows up with a post driver when your fence is down, the brand inspector who does his job even when he thinks the whole thing is nonsense. A ranch is an economy of favors and fatigue. A ranch is a machine built out of human bodies. And the cost of the mystery doesn't land on the producers. It lands on those bodies. It lands on the man who has to ride farther because people have been cutting fences. It lands on the woman who has to answer the phone when strangers call at night. It lands on the hired hand who has to haul a carcass that looks wrong and pretend it doesn't get under his skin. It lands on the deputy who has to drive out again knowing he can't offer anything but a report number and a shrug. Meanwhile, the outside world talks about the ranch as if it's a throne. But inside the gate, the throne is made of invoices. Even in the cleanest year, no mutilations, no headlines. The money is not mythic, it is granular. A cow worth $150 one season can be worth $2,500 another, and in both seasons she can die the same way, quietly, inconveniently, expensively. Each animal is a gamble with hide on it. Each calf is a future payment that may never arrive. The rancher's royalty is measured in how long he can keep playing that game without losing the land to someone with cleaner hands. And the deeper truth is this: the American cattle empire, whether it's a small operation on 1,600 acres or a vast corporate outfit, has always been less about romance than about systems. Railroads, packing plants, feedlots, commodity markets that turn living animals into numbers, laws that decide who can graze where and when, like the Taylor Grazing Act of 1934, which carved the public range into permits and politics and a quiet kind of dependency. Even the federal code that once haunted the mutilation panic, Title 18, U.S. Code, Section 2311, speaks the language of the state. Cattle as commerce, cattle as property, cattle as evidence only when they move across lines on a map. So, when people call the rancher a king, what they're really doing is flattering a man who is, in truth, chained to forces bigger than he is. And in that flattery is the trap. Because a king is expected to control his realm. A king is expected to keep invaders out. A king is expected to know what happens on his land. But what happens when the crown, this fame, this myth, this unwanted royalty, lands on a ranch just as the economy shifts under its feet, just as markets turn cruel and the cost of being wrong becomes unbearable? They'll tell you ranching is old money, that cattle are as solid as land, that a man with grass and water and a few hundred head can ride out any storm the way his granddad did, jaw set, eyes narrowed, waiting for the sky to pass. But the reality is the storm doesn't always come from the sky. Sometimes it comes from a ledger. Sometimes it comes from Washington. Sometimes It comes from the radio in a pickup, spitting out numbers that make a grown man go quiet. It is the early 70s, and the West is still selling itself as timeless. Postcards of open range, pickup commercials, a nation hungry for the taste of something real. Out near Trinidad, the Miller place sits on about 1,600 acres, and the work is the same work it always was: fences, water, feed, calves, several hundred head moving through seasons like a slow-breathing inventory. A cow is not a symbol when you're the one hauling hay. A cow is a weight, a cost, a promise you might not be able to keep. And then the world shifts. August 15th, 1971, a date most ranchers didn't ask for and couldn't vote away, Richard Nixon goes on television and announces a wage and price freeze. 90 days, he says. A blunt instrument swung at inflation. Out on the range, it sounds like distant politics. But it isn't distant for long, because a ranch lives in the space between what you pay and what you're allowed to charge. And when a government starts putting its thumb on prices, it's pressing down on somebody's throat. You can't freeze the cost of diesel with a speech. You can't freeze the cost of feed. You can't freeze the weather. But you can freeze what beef brings at market. And when you do that, you aren't freezing time. You're freezing a man's options. The sale barn still opens. The coffee still burns in the pot. The auctioneer still runs his tongue like a motor. But the mood changes. Men stop talking in full sentences. They lean on rails and listen the way you'd listen at a bedside. You can hear the economy in the sound of bidding. When times are decent, bids come quick, sharp, confident. When times go bad, there's a pause after every call, a little dead air where everyone waits for someone else to admit what things are worth now. A rancher watches his animals step into the ring. Black hides, wide backs, calves bawling for mothers, and he tries not to take it personally. But it is personal. It's his year walking in circles under fluorescent lights. Then comes October 17th, 1973. The oil shock, OPEC's embargo, hits the country like a fist. Gas lines rationing, anger. Out on the ranch, it doesn't look like geopolitics. It looks like fuel costing more and being harder to find. It looks like trucks that don't run for free. It looks like the cost of hauling feed, hauling cattle, hauling anything, climbing, while the price on the other end of the haul is controlled, capped, argued over by men in suits. A rancher doesn't need to read the newspapers to feel it. He feels it in the first hard start of a cold engine, in the needle dropping faster than it used to, in the bill that arrives with a number that feels like it belongs to someone else's life. And the country, already tense, already tired, finds a villain it can understand: meat. By late 1973, people in cities are furious about the price of beef in grocery stores. Boycotts flare up. Politicians posture. Everybody talks like beef is a moral issue instead of a chain of costs. In the middle of it sits the rancher, the least powerful man in the conversation, watching the whole thing get simplified into slogans. In town, they think he's getting rich. At the packing plants and the supermarkets, they swear their margins are thin. Everyone points at everyone else, and the rancher is left with a truth nobody wants to hear. He can't eat ideology. He has to pay bills. A ranch is not just land. It's timing. You buy feed when you must, not when it's cheap. You sell calves when they're ready, not when Washington is calm. You borrow when you have to, not when interest is kind. And the early 70s are not kind. Inflation rises, costs climb. The old faith, work hard, keep your head down, the market will be fair, starts to rot. A man can do everything right and still get gutted. On January 2nd, 1974, the federal government signs the national 55-mile-per-hour speed limit into law. Another response to the energy crisis, another reminder that the state can reach into daily life and tighten the rules. Out on the highways near Trinidad, the semis still rumble through, but everything feels watched, constrained, as if the nation has decided to cope by squeezing itself and hoping the squeeze will stop the bleeding. And here's the thing ranchers learn in those years, the lesson that earns its nickname in bitter mouths. The wreck isn't one event. It's a season that won't end. It's the day you look at your herd and realize each animal is both wealth and liability. It's the day you do the math and see that keeping them through winter might cost more than selling them now. But selling them now locks in a loss you'll feel for years. It's the day you stand in a barn aisle at a sale and watch your cattle go for less than you believe they're worth. Not in pride, but in fact, because you know what you paid for feed. You know what you paid for fencing. You know how many mornings you broke ice just to get them water. The market doesn't care. The market never cared. The market is not a person you can argue with. The market is a weather system made of money. A rancher goes home from the sale barn with an envelope that feels too light. He sets it on the kitchen table. He pours coffee. He looks at the calendar on the wall and begins circling dates, when the note is due, when the auction is, when the calves will ship, when the grass might come back if God is generous. He does not talk about fear. He talks about logistics. But fear is there, sitting in the chair across from him like a creditor, and in that pressure, when money is tight and pride is tighter, mystery becomes more dangerous. Because a man can accept a hard market as impersonal misfortune. He can curse it, but he can't chase it. Yet if cattle start turning up dead in ways that feel chosen, if losses stop looking like weather and start looking like intent, then the wreck isn't just economic. It becomes existential. It becomes a question of control, of invasion, of whether anyone, county, state, federal, will treat a rancher's reality as real. So when the market has already broken your back, and then something begins taking from you in the night, clean, quiet, unanswered, who do you call first? The banker or the law? They say the government stepped in like a sheriff in an old photograph, boots on the porch, hand resting near the gun, eyes narrowed at the horizon, and that when Washington or Santa Fe finally decided to take it seriously, the mystery would have to confess. But the reality is the government does not step in. It arrives in pieces. A memo, a phone call, a meeting pushed back twice because a man with authority is stuck in traffic or stuck in a committee room, a file folder that smells like stale smoke and copier toner, a badge that has never had to stand alone in a pasture at dawn and explain to a rancher why the law cannot arrest a shadow. It starts, as these things so often do, with embarrassment. Not the rancher's embarrassment. That comes later, when he hears the laugh in someone's voice and feels his own anger rise like bile. The government's embarrassment, because by the late 1970s, the reports have become a kind of national bruise. Cattle turning up dead with the same parts missing, people talking about helicopters, people talking about the sky. Legislators being asked, in plain daylight, whether they intend to protect the livelihood of the people who feed the country. The state cannot admit it is helpless, but it also cannot prove it is capable. And that thin space between pride and proof is where bureaucracy begins to move. New Mexico becomes the pressure point, the way a knot in wood becomes the place the axe keeps striking. Northern counties, big sky, old ranch families, and a public that's had enough of being told they're imagining what they saw with their own eyes. So the state does what it can do without promising too much. It names the thing, Operation Animal Mutilation. Even the title is an admission. It doesn't say investigation. It doesn't say task force. It says operation, like war, like a siege, like something organized and hostile. And once the state gives it a name, it can justify the machinery, the meetings, the travel, the overtime, the paperwork that turns fear into a budget line. The room where it begins is not dramatic. Fluorescent light, cheap coffee, men in uniform with their chairs tilted back, a telephone on the wall that rings too often, a map spread across a table, counties, highways, ranch roads, long blank spaces where the land refuses to be reduced into ink. They pin reports to the board, they mark dates, they circle clusters. They argue about patterns the way fishermen argue about weather. And then the state does what states do when they want legitimacy. They bring in a professional, a man with a federal past, a man whose name carries the weight of training and procedure. A retired FBI agent, Kenneth Rommel, pulled in because the public likes the idea that there's a level above local law enforcement, a higher floor of the building where smarter men make sense of chaos. He arrives with no myth in his eyes, no romance, just the habits of investigation. Ask what is known, separate it from what is believed, and treat everything else as noise until it proves itself otherwise. He reads the reports first. That's always the first violence, taking the living panic of a community and flattening it into typed pages, case numbers, locations, animal descriptions. Missing tongue, missing eye, no blood, no tracks. Each phrase repeated until it becomes less like a shock and more like a stamp. Then he goes out. He stands where the ranchers stood. Only later, because the call doesn't happen when death happens. It happens when death is discovered. By the time he arrives, the sun has already altered the scene. The wind has already swept the ground. The insects have already made their claims. And the rancher is watching him the way a man watches a doctor, with hope that feels like fear, because a diagnosis can ruin you just as surely as it can save you. Rommel walks the perimeter. He kneels. He looks for tracks, not with wonder, but with method. He asks about the weather, what time the rancher last saw the animal alive, what time it was found, whether there was rain, whether there was wind, whether the herd moved through after. He asks about predators in the area, about dogs, about recent sickness. He asks questions that sound, to a rancher, like excuses. Because the rancher is not asking for possibility. The rancher is asking for certainty, and certainty is the one thing an honest investigator cannot give. Back in town, they hold another meeting. Deputies, state police, livestock inspectors, maybe a veterinarian if they can spare one. They talk about what a cow actually is under the hide, a body that collapses in predictable ways once it's dead. They talk about scavengers that go first for the soft parts because soft parts don't fight back. They talk about how a cut made by a beak and widened by drying skin can look as clean as any blade. They talk about how blood can pool internally, sink inward, vanish into soil that's thirsty and dark. But the ranchers don't want a lecture. They want a culprit. So the state tries another angle. They look for theft. If parts are being removed, maybe they're being sold. If something is being harvested, maybe there's a market for it. Some black economy built on panic. And the moment you talk about theft, you run into the same cold gate the federal government always builds: jurisdiction, paper boundaries, statutes. The old language, Title 18, U.S. Code, Section 2311, the interstate problem. If you can't prove a thing crossed a line on the map, the federal machine won't turn. The state can push, but the state also has limits. It cannot chase every rumor into every canyon. So the investigation keeps moving like that. Forward in small steps, backward in frustration. They take photographs. They compare wounds. They try to catch the moment where myth becomes fact. And in the course of doing it, Rommel begins to see what investigators always see when the public insists on a singular, monstrous answer that most cases are not one thing. They are many things wearing the same mask. Some are predation. Some are scavenging. Some are sickness and decay misunderstood by people who arrive after the body has started to change. And some, just enough to keep everyone awake, remain stubbornly strange, not because they prove aliens or cults, but because the chain of custody is broken before it begins. No fresh scene, no preserved evidence, no clean timeline, just a dead animal and a community hungry for meaning. By 1980, Rommel puts his conclusions down in writing, an official answer as official as the state can manage. It does not give the public what it wants. It does not confirm the sky. It does not confirm a conspiracy. It points, again and again, to the blunt mechanics of death: scavengers, decomposition, misinterpretation, the ordinary brutality of the natural world mistaken for intention. And the reaction is immediate, because it always is. To the people who wanted a monster, the report reads like a dismissal. To the people who wanted the whole thing to go away, it reads like relief. And to the ranchers who have held a dead cow's head in their hands and stared into that wrongness, the cleanliness, the absence, the quiet, it reads like the oldest insult the powerful can offer the powerless. You're mistaken. But the state doesn't get to close the file just because it wrote a report. The reports keep coming. The rumors keep spreading. The night watches continue. Men still sit in trucks with rifles and thermoses, listening for engines in the dark, because no paper in Santa Fe can protect a pasture at 3 a.m. And out beyond the pasture, the highway keeps running through the land like a blade, collecting its own dead with indifferent consistency, a second ledger nobody can explain away with scavengers. So if the investigators can't find a hand on the knife, if they can't prove a culprit, a method, a motive, what happens when the story stops looking for a person and starts blaming the land itself? They'll tell you the ranch is cursed, that the ground is wrong, that it swallows life the way a sinkhole swallows rainwater, quiet, impartial, hungry. They'll point to the cattle in the pasture and the crosses by the roadside, and they'll say it like a prayer: this place takes. But the reality is simpler and meaner. The reality is asphalt. A highway running through a working ranch is not a line on a map. It is an argument you can't win. It is the modern world laid down like a blade, straight, hard, and indifferent to what it cuts. On the Miller Place, about 600 acres of pasture and fence and wind, the highway is the one thing you cannot move, cannot bargain with, cannot chase off with a rifle shot or a lock on the gate. It just keeps coming. In daylight, it looks almost harmless, a ribbon of gray with white paint and the occasional shimmer of heat. Cars pass like thoughts, fast and gone. Trucks roll through long and loud, dragging their weight behind them as if the earth itself is resisting. Federal law lets those semis run up to 80,000 pounds, gross weight, steel and freight and momentum, and that weight changes the atmosphere around it. You feel it in your chest when it goes by. It has its own gravity. At night, the highway turns into something older, something predatory. Headlights crest the rise and sweep the pasture like a searchlight. The beams rake over fence posts, over cattle backs, over grass that looks silver in the glare. In the cab of a passing truck, a man fights sleep and time and schedules, holding a line through darkness that never ends. A rancher hears that traffic the way a sailor hears the sea, always present, always moving, always capable of killing without intending to. They say more than 15 people have died on that stretch. People turning too fast, drifting too wide, driving tired or drunk or simply unlucky. The number gets repeated because numbers have the authority of stone. 15 doesn't sound like rumor. It sounds like a tally carved into wood, a running count. And the count does something to the mind. A single crash is tragedy. A handful becomes reputation. Enough of them and the land itself starts wearing the blame because it's easier to accuse dirt than to accept randomness. Easier to call it a hot spot than to admit that a highway is a machine that eats the slow, the distracted, the human. Out by the shoulder, little white crosses appear like fence posts for the dead. Some are fresh, the paint still clean. Some are weathered down to gray wood, as if the sun itself has been trying to erase the names. Wind hits those crosses all year long. In winter, the wind comes hard and sharp, and in summer, it comes hot and constant, pushing dust across the road like smoke. A rancher drives past them to check water, to mend wire, to haul feed. He doesn't stop at everyone. Nobody could. But he sees them. He feels them. The same way he feels every missing head count in his herd. Because the highway doesn't just kill drivers, it changes cattle. A herd can live with coyotes. A herd can live with storms. But a highway is a permanent disturbance. Noise, vibration, the sudden flare of light. Cattle spook. They bolt. They push fences. They drift toward the right-of-way because grass grows differently along that strip. Water runoff, softer ground, the accidental fertility of a road. And every time an animal moves toward the road, the rancher's stomach tightens because the road doesn't care if that animal is worth $1,500 or $3,000 or more. The road doesn't care if it's a cow heavy with calf, if it's a steer you meant to sell to pay the note. The road is not cruel. It's worse than cruel. It's indifferent. The national speed limit tells its own story of that indifference. In 1974, the United States imposed the 55-mile-per-hour limit as an energy measure, a way to squeeze the country tighter during the fuel crisis. It was supposed to save gas. It also saved some lives, at least in theory, by slowing the violence of impact. But the road never became safe. It just became slower, sometimes. Then in 1995, the national mandate was repealed and the states took their own measure of risk again. Speeds crept up. The math of stopping distance got worse. The margin for error shrank. The way it always shrinks when people get comfortable. Now imagine living with that margin, day after day, year after year. Imagine being the person who has to mend fence along the highway shoulder with traffic sucking past at a speed that makes your hat brim tremble. Imagine bending down to twist wire while a semi passes close enough that you can smell brake dust and hot rubber. Imagine doing that work not once, but in every season. Summer heat shimmering off the road. Winter ice turning the shoulder into glass. Now add the other tally, the one that comes from the pasture. 1996. The first year they say the counting began, the first calf found wrong. 16. The number that turns a private horror into a narrative. 2020. The year the reports still haven't stopped, proving time hasn't solved it. Two ledgers running side by side, cattle and cars, and the human mind doing what it always does when faced with parallel suffering, stitching them together, making one story out of two, calling it destiny, calling it a pattern, calling it the land's appetite. And in the middle of it, a ranch family trying to keep the ordinary work from collapsing under the extraordinary talk. Because here's the part no one glamorizes. Most of the death isn't cinematic, it's administrative. A crash means phone calls, paperwork, statements, a wrecker's lights turning the night into a rotating red wound. A deputy leaning on a hood, writing with a pen that keeps skipping because the air is cold. A rancher answering questions even when he had nothing to do with it, because the crash happened on his land and the world needs an address for grief. A dead cow means a different kind of paperwork, a different kind of silence, a different kind of standing over something you can't fix and trying to decide whether you're looking at nature or intrusion or misfortune dressed up as intent. Over time, the highway and the mutilations start feeding each other. The road brings strangers. The story brings strangers. The crashes bring more stories. The stories bring more attention. Attention brings trespass. Trespass brings fear. Fear brings vigilance. Vigilance brings more sightings, more claims, more certainty. And that is how a place becomes haunted without any ghost ever showing up. Not by the supernatural, by repetition, by the constant reinforcement of loss until the mind can't separate coincidence from cause. So if a highway can turn an ordinary ranch into a place people whisper about, if a running tally of 15 dead drivers and 16 dead cattle can brand the land like a hot iron, what happens when the modern world decides to monetize that brand, to dress old dread in new clothes and sell it back to the country as entertainment? They'll tell you the modern age finally solved it, that the old mysteries, the kind that lived in grainy photographs and secondhand testimony, couldn't survive the arrival of drones and thermal cameras and satellite maps you can pinch and zoom with your thumb. They'll tell you that if something real was happening out there, the 21st century would catch it, record it, upload it, put it to bed. But the reality is the 21st century doesn't kill mysteries. It franchises them. A ranch like the Miller Place, 1 to 600 acres of wind-scraped pasture and fence line, and the constant work of keeping animals alive, was built for things that can be measured by hand. Water depth in a trough, the weight of a calf when you rope it and drag it close, the number of head that come back through the gate at dusk. It was not built for the new economy, where attention is the only commodity that never spoils and never runs out. Out there, the old wealth was counted in cattle, 200 head, 300 head, whatever the grass and the bank would allow. In the new world, wealth is counted in views and clicks and the cold miracle of engagement. And once the story of the ranch escapes into that new world, it doesn't come back as itself. It comes back as a brand. Somewhere far from Trinidad, a meeting happens in an office that smells like carpet cleaner and coffee pods. A producer leans over a table and talks about assets. Not cattle, not land. Assets. The word is the same, but the meaning has shifted. The ranch isn't a workplace to them. It's a location, a hook, a premise that can be sold in a sentence. 16 mutilations, someone says, because numbers sound like proof. Started in 1996, someone adds, because a long timeline makes it feel historic. Still happening as late as 2020, someone says, because ongoing danger makes it feel urgent. And that highway, someone else remembers, more than 15 dead, because nothing lends gravity like a second body count. They write it all down. They circle it. They nod. In that room, the ranch becomes a pitch deck. It becomes a storyboard of dread. It becomes content. And content has its own weather. It demands a rhythm, a reveal every few minutes, a cliffhanger before the break, a voice that asks questions it doesn't want answered too quickly, because if the mystery ends, the series ends. If the story resolves, the audience moves on to the next bruise. The algorithm doesn't reward closure, it rewards appetite. So the people arrive. They come in clean vehicles with tinted windows and expensive cameras and hard cases that click open like toolboxes. They come with polite smiles and release forms and the particular kind of enthusiasm that is not joy but momentum. The momentum of a production that has already spent money and must now justify it. They walk the pasture with equipment slung over their shoulders like weapons. They take measurements. They point. They say things like hotspot and pattern and activity. They speak the language of investigation, but it's a performance of investigation because the real investigation, slow, meticulous, boring, is the enemy of television. They put up cameras, not one, many, because one camera is a witness and many cameras are a promise. We will catch it this time. They mount them on posts. They angle them down fence lines. They bury them in brush. They strap them to trees that have survived 100 winters. They set them to trigger on motion because that's what the audience understands. Movement as proof of presence. They use thermal imaging because it looks like truth, because heat signatures feel scientific, because the colors and contours turn darkness into something legible. A white shape moving in the night becomes a question. A warm blotch near a carcass becomes a threat. The machine does not tell you what it is, coyote, deer, human, cow, but it gives you a picture. And in a culture starved for certainty, a picture is a sacrament. And still, the pasture keeps its secrets. Batteries die, memory cards fill, wind triggers sensors, rabbits set off alarms. Cattle rub against posts and tilt cameras toward the sky. The night is vast. The ranch is bigger than any grid you can lay on it. Even on 1,600 acres, there are pockets of darkness that will never be watched at the right moment, because the right moment is always elsewhere. Somewhere beyond the fence line, somewhere between frames. So the production does what productions do when reality won't cooperate. It leans harder on narrative. A rancher's exhausted shrug becomes a close-up. A long, quiet drive down a dirt road becomes suspense. An empty sky becomes ominous, because the music says it is. A dead cow, whether killed by scavengers, sickness, cruelty, or something unknown, becomes a symbol the moment it's framed in the viewfinder. The story stops being what happened and becomes what could be happening, because could is the most profitable verb in modern America. And the rancher, who once measured his life in fences repaired and calves weaned, finds himself measured in reactions. People online argue about his sincerity. They freeze-frame his face as if the truth is hiding in his pores. They say he's lying, or scared, or in on it, or too stupid to understand decomposition. They say the government is watching him. They say he's making it up for attention. They say he deserves the attention. They say he's cursed. None of those people have to step over the body in the grass. None of them have to drag it away. None of them have to call the sheriff and hear the patience draining out of a man's voice. This is the new skin the old fear wears, not merely rumor, but community. Not merely a campfire story, but a distributed jury of strangers who never sleep. The mystery becomes participatory, and participation feels like power. A man in another state who has never seen Trinidad can feel for a moment like he's helping solve it by posting a theory at 2 in the morning. And somewhere in the middle of all that, the original economy, the cattle economy, keeps grinding on. Feed still costs what it costs. The bank still wants its payment. A cow is still worth what the market says she's worth, whether that's $100 on a bad day or $3,000 on a better one. But now there's a second ledger, the attention ledger. The ranch's name carries value that has nothing to do with grass. And that value is dangerous because when attention becomes currency, mystery becomes incentive. Every unanswered question becomes a reason to keep filming. Every rumor becomes a lead. Every anomaly becomes an episode. The old fear, something comes in the night and takes what's yours, doesn't disappear. It simply finds a way to pay. So when the cameras and drones and algorithms have done what they do, when they've widened the story, sharpened the edges, sold the dread, what happens when someone finally tries to bring the one thing television can't afford? Slow, methodical science. The laboratory stepping into the pasture with gloves and sample bags and a clock that doesn't care about ratings? They'll tell you science is a guillotine, that it drops clean and final, that once the lab gets involved, the mystery ends the way a story ends in a textbook. Cause identified, mechanism explained, case closed, everyone goes home. But the reality is, science doesn't arrive like a blade. It arrives like a pickup truck that's late. It arrives with a cooler full of ice packs, a clipboard smeared with dust, and a person who has already driven 90 miles one way because 90 miles in ranch country is not far. It's just what you do. It arrives after the sun has already warmed the carcass and the flies have already found it. It arrives after the coyotes have already done their edits. It arrives into a world that has been telling the story without it for years, and it has to fight rumor for every inch of ground. The day the laboratory comes to the pasture, the air is sharp with that sour sweetness that makes your stomach tighten. The carcass is out there in plain sight, but it still feels like something you're not supposed to look at too long. Even the cattle keep their distance, standing off in a loose arc, watching. Animals always know when death is near. They know it the way weather knows itself. The person who steps out of the truck is not a television investigator. There's no swagger, no dramatic pause. It's a veterinarian or a field biologist or someone trained in animal pathology, someone who has learned to treat bodies as evidence instead of symbols. They pull on nitrile gloves. They open a kit. The sounds are small and practical, the snap of rubber, the click of a latch, the scrape of metal against plastic. And the first thing they ask, always, is the question nobody on television likes because it's boring and brutal. What time was it last seen alive? Because everything depends on the clock. If the animal was alive at 6 p.m. and found dead at 7 a.m., that's a window. 13 hours. In summer heat, 13 hours is long enough for insects to build a city. In winter, cold, 13 hours might preserve a scene like meat in a freezer. Out on 600 acres, time behaves differently. A cow can die a quarter mile from the road and not be discovered till the next day because the pasture is big and labor is finite. By the time the rancher finds it, the evidence has already been living its own life without witnesses. The second question is the one that feels like an insult, even when it isn't. Was the carcass moved? Ranchers move carcasses. They have to. A dead animal near a water source can contaminate it. A carcass too close to the road draws scavengers into traffic. A body left in a pasture can attract predators and spook the herd. In some places, disposal is regulated, rendering, burial, hauling, and every method costs money. A rendering pickup might charge $75 or $150 depending on distance and weight, and on a tight year, those numbers matter. The lab person knows this. They also know that once you move a carcass, you move the story with it. You rearrange the scene. You lose the original context, the direction the animal fell, the way the blood pooled, the tracks in the dirt that might have meant something before the wind took them. So the lab person walks the ground. They don't look up at the sky. They look down. They note the slope. They note the soil. They note the grass. They look for insect activity. They look for scat. They look for hair. They look for the tiny forensic details that don't thrill an audience but decide the truth. Then they examine the cuts. This is where the myth lives. Surgical, laser, too clean. The lab person doesn't argue with adjectives. They replace them with anatomy. They inspect the edges of the wound. Is it smooth because of a blade, or is it smooth because the skin dried and tightened, pulling back like shrink wrap and making the opening look sharper than it was? They look for hemorrhaging, true bleeding into the tissue, because hemorrhaging means the animal was alive when the cut was made. No hemorrhaging suggests the cut happened after death, when blood no longer moves. They look for bruising. They look for tearing. They look for tooth punctures so small you can miss them if you're already convinced you're seeing a knife. They open the body cavity. This is where the romance dies, if it's going to die at all. Because inside, the body tells the truth in ways the outside cannot. Blood that isn't there can be there, pooled, clotted, dark as oil. Organs can show disease, lungs can show pneumonia, the rumen can show bloat. The liver can show toxins. A cow can die of something that leaves no drama on the hide, and scavengers can arrive afterward and make it look like a crime. But even science has its limits out here. A proper necropsy takes time and tools and often money. If you want laboratory confirmation, histology, toxicology, bacterial culture, you need samples kept cold. You need shipping. You need chain of custody. You need forms. And forms are the language of institutions that ranchers have been burned by before. If a rancher is asked to spend $300 or $500 to ship samples and run tests on an animal already lost, he has to decide whether he's paying for truth or paying for the privilege of being told what he already suspects. Inconclusive. And then there's the third enemy, reputation. Rural law enforcement and veterinary services live under budgets that get carved thinner every year. People talk about the giggle factor, the way a case gets laughed out of the room if it smells like UFOs or witchcraft. A deputy might hesitate to file it as anything beyond possible predation, because he doesn't want his name attached to a circus. A state lab might not prioritize it because the queue is long and funding is short. Science out here is not omnipotent. It is triage. So the lab person does what they can. They take swabs. They take tissue. They take photographs with a scale ruler in the frame, because science measures, always. They bag samples and label them with a date, say July 14th, 2020, if that's when the rancher insists it happened, because the label has to say something even when memory is shaky. They note the location in coordinates because coordinates don't care about legend. They write down ambient temperature because temperature decides decay. They note wind because wind erases tracks. They do the work that is invisible on television and essential everywhere. And when they're done, they pull off the gloves and stand there in the wind, looking at the rancher, and the rancher looks back with that same question he's carried since the first carcass. So what was it? The lab person doesn't give him the ending he wants. Not because they're cold, but because they're honest. They tell him what they can say, what the wound edges suggest, what the tissue shows, what scavengers could have done, what the timeline allows. They also tell him what they can't say, who exactly did it, whether it will happen again. Whether any of this will ever be proved in a way that shuts people up. Science is not a guillotine. It's a lantern. It lights a circle. Everything outside that circle remains dark. So if the lab can only illuminate part of the pasture, if it can explain the mechanics but not the motive, the how but not the why, what does a ranch family do next when the mystery won't give them closure and the economics won't give them patience? In the end, it never becomes a single thing, not a single culprit with a single knife, not a single aircraft with a single shadow beneath it. The story refuses that kind of mercy because the West, real West, working West, doesn't give you clean endings. It gives you seasons. It gives you debt. It gives you weather that comes like judgment and markets that come like fate. It gives you a dead cow in the grass and a choice. You can accept the ordinary brutality of nature, or you can insist on an intelligence behind it, because intelligence, however cruel, is easier to live with than randomness. They will always want it to be a great man tale. A lone rancher standing on 1/600 acres like a sentinel, squinting at the horizon, daring the unknown to come closer. It's the kind of American portrait we hang in our minds because it flatters us, because it says one hard person can stand against the world. But the ranch doesn't run on portraits. It runs on the invisible workforce, the spouse with the ledger and the phone calls and the quiet panic at the kitchen table when the numbers don't add, the hired hand whose knees ache before he's 50, the neighbor who shows up unasked with a post driver and a spool of wire because he knows tomorrow it could be his fence down, the deputy who drives out again, not because he believes in the sky, but because a citizen called and the job is still the job, the veterinarian who can't afford to be romantic about death because romance doesn't tell you where hemorrhaging stops and scavenging begins, the brand inspector, the auctioneer, the feed supplier, the mechanic, the whole hidden architecture of a rural economy that never gets camera time because it's too ordinary to sell. And yet, it is the only thing holding the place up. What the Miller story reveals, if it reveals anything at all, is not proof of the paranormal. It reveals the shape of American hunger. We hunger for a villain we can name. We hunger for a story with edges. We hunger for authority that can walk into the pasture and say, "Here, this is what happened. This is who did it. This is how it ends." But the institutions we built, county law, state law, federal law, weren't built for mysteries that don't travel well through paperwork. They were built for crimes with suspects, for theft with receipts, for jurisdiction with boundaries you can draw in ink. So when the fear swells past those boundaries, what does the state do? It names a statute. Title 18, U.S. Code, Section 2311. It points to interstate lines and says the machine only turns if the evidence crosses them. And that answer, true as it may be, lands on a rancher's life like a kind of abandonment, because a rancher does not live by statutes. He lives by fence lines and head counts and whether the grass will hold out until first snow. That gap between what people suffer and what institutions can address is where myth grows best, and myth, in the modern era, has found a new pasture. It used to live in diners and church basements, and the slow burn of rumor moving from county to county. Now it lives in feeds and clips and titles that have to hook you in 3 seconds or die. The old economy was cattle. The new economy is attention. And attention has its own rules. It rewards the unresolved, the uncanny, the endlessly discussable. It punishes closure. It punishes nuance. It punishes the sentence, "We don't know." So the mystery survives by changing its skin. A mutilation becomes content. A ranch becomes a set. A body becomes a thumbnail. The story is solved and unsolved in the same breath because both words sell. And the people who live on that land, who still have to drag carcasses, still have to mend wire, still have to pay feed bills, find themselves living inside a narrative they did not write. This is where the cynicism earns its place, because whether the cuts were made by scavengers arriving at the soft places first, or by a human hand with some private motive, or by some rarer thing we haven't pinned down, the outcome is the same. The rancher pays. The cow is still dead. The value, $4,500, $3, whatever the market says that year, is still gone. And the cost isn't only money. It's sleep. It's trust. It's the feeling that the world can enter your life without knocking and leave you standing there with nothing but questions. And then there's the other ledger, the highway, over 15 dead, they say. Crosses in the dirt like punctuation marks in a sentence nobody wants to finish. A road slicing through pasture, bringing strangers, bringing speed, bringing tragedy that doesn't require any mystery at all. That road teaches the same lesson the mutilations teach, just louder. Life can be taken in broad daylight, and the cause can still feel meaningless. A tired driver, a moment of inattention, a deer in the beam of headlights. And afterward, the state files its report, and the wind keeps blowing. So what kills a cow in America? Sometimes it's disease, sometimes it's weather. Sometimes it's a predator doing what predators do, cleanly and without malice. Sometimes it's a human being, because there has never been a shortage of cruelty in a country that learned early how to turn living things into commodities. And sometimes what kills the cow is not the cause of death at all, but what comes after, the story laid over the body like a tarp, heavy with meaning, dragging everyone who touches it into the same argument. Was it an act of nature or an act of intention? Was it ignorance dressed up as certainty, or certainty dressed up as ignorance? Was it a mystery worth chasing, or a mirror held up to a nation that can't tolerate the idea that the universe doesn't owe us explanations? America has always been a place where the myth comes first and the labor comes second. We praise the man on horseback and forget the hands that built the corral. We celebrate the romance of open land and ignore the banknote stapled to it. We tell ourselves the frontier was conquered by courage when it was conquered by capital, by rail lines and laws and debt and the quiet machinery that turns grass into beef and beef into cash. And when that machinery stutters, when markets crash like they did in the early 1970s, when a national speed limit arrives in 1974 and disappears in 1995, when the state cannot reach into the pasture with certainty, people don't just lose money. They lose their sense of order. So they reach for a bigger story, a story with an enemy that makes sense, a story with a sky big enough to hold their fear. And still, for all the talk, the ending returns to the beginning, because it always does. Morning again, thin air, sage bruised under a boot, a gait that swings a little too freely. A man riding out because he has to, because the animals don't pause for philosophy. He counts heads the way a priest counts beads. 1, 2, 3. The number is wrong. He feels it before he sees it. That small drop in the stomach, that old knowledge that something has gone missing. And there, in the grass, the body lies with its terrible quiet, opened in a way that makes the mind hunt for meaning. The tongue gone, the eye gone, the blood not where it should be, the land already beginning to erase the scene, the wind already turning the page, and the question stands there with him as plain and unresolved as ever. Is this just the prairie doing what it does? Fast, efficient, indifferent? Or is it something else, something that knows exactly how to take what it wants and leave you with nothing but silence?